Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Battle of Newbury, 1643, English Civil War by Kings and Generals. So, in the first two episodes of this series, we witnessed the build-up to the English Civil War and sort of the first major battle of the war. I'm excited to see where we go from here. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
In our previous video, we covered how the English Civil War finally broke out after decades of build-up.
And that build-up largely revolved around tension between Parliament and King Charles. Charles wanted to be one of these absolute monarchs who ruled through the grace of God and had no limits on his power, and Parliament very much wanted to limit his power, and that led to many political clashes, eventually led to this war breaking out.
Ultimately leading to the conflict's first major pitched battle at Edgehill in October 1642. Many spectators and participants alike hoped this clash would end the conflict.
Yeah, but like many participants in wars, particularly civil wars, the participants felt like, this first battle might bring it to an end. I mean, say if we look at the American Civil War, the Confederates at Fort Sumter felt like that would be the end of the war. They've started the war, they've ended it. It's over. Secession is done. Now, what actually happened was a several-year-long, extremely bloody civil war. It's kind of the same thing here. They've had this build-up, they have this one battle, they think, well, maybe one side will win, and then it'll be over, or maybe something can be worked out. Instead, what happened was years of pretty brutal fighting.
But they were tragically mistaken, for the flawed generalship and heavy losses among King Charles I's royalist army would lead to a deadlock that trapped the British Isles in bitter civil war for almost another 2 decades. Welcome to our third piece of the 17th century English Civil Wars, where we will explore the events surrounding Charles's march on London and the campaign of 1643, culminating at the First Battle of Newbury.
Okay.
We're also going to highlight a time when monarchs had a much tighter hold on unruly England through our sponsor Magellan TV, who brings you their...
Alright, so shout out to Kings and Generals. You guys know the deal. Please go and check out their video, which is linked down below. Go give them a like, subscribe to their channel. Please go check out their sponsor. Basically, show them support for making such fantastic videos.
At no extra cost. It's all viewable anytime, anywhere, on televisions, laptops, mobile devices, and more. Get access to 3,500 hours of ad-free documentaries for only $4.99 a month, and get a month for free by subscribing to Magellan TV via our link in the description.
Go show them support.
Having suffered the first defeat of the war at Edgehill in 1642, the Earl of Essex's battered and demoralised parliamentary army retreated north to the safety of Warwick Castle. Meanwhile, jubilant at the news of his army's victory, and urged by his firebrand cavalry commander, Prince Rupert, King Charles I ordered a measured advance towards London. He advanced via Banbury, which capitulated on October 26th, then took Oxford, the city which would become the Royalist cause's beating heart throughout the First War. While the main armies of both factions thrust and parried each other's blows near England's great capital city.
I mean, this really was Charles's best opportunity to bring this whole thing to an end. Perhaps it may not have been that clear at the time, but looking in retrospect, he's sort of, in an advantageous position right now. Perhaps if he'd pressed a little harder, he could have brought this thing, he could have closed this war, ended this war. Maybe not. But whether he could have or, it was impossible, this probably was his best chance. Well, his best chance was, not get into this situation in the first place, be a little more moderate, a little more conciliatory, but, that's not what he was about.
The embers of conflict also burst into flames in the outlying counties. In the north, the Earl of Newcastle, Charles's appointed military governor in the region, assembled a small but disciplined army and faced off against the parliamentarian Lord Fairfax, and his prodigious son and second-in-command, Sir Thomas.
Important. Keep an eye on Fairfax.
Throughout the course of 1642, Newcastle gradually gained the upper hand in Yorkshire, pushing the anti-Cavalier forces back to Selby. He enjoyed such success that in December, the Earl even received royal thanks for his service. In the West Country, Royalist and Parliamentary forces fought a small-scale war of raids and counter-raids near the Welsh border, a state of affairs that would continue well into 1643. In this theatre too, the King's men gained the upper hand. As the war on the periphery continued, the King's main army resumed its march on London after stopping at Reading to consolidate. However,
So far, if you look at the whole picture, it looks like it's going pretty well for the Royalists. If you were to be in this position at the time, no knowledge of the future, it'd be a pretty good guess to make that the king might win this war. Of course, that's not how it's going to end up, but at this point, that is kind of how it looks if you had to make a presumption.
But this delay allowed Essex to overtake his opponent by moving via Northampton, reaching London before the Royalists got there. The armies clashed again on November 11th, when Royalist troops under Rupert caught and badly mauled 2 regiments of Parliamentary horse near Brentford, a key staging point on the way to London. Much like they had at Edgehill, the Prince's victorious troops went too far instead of consolidating their position. This time, rather than simply taking Brentford as a prelude to moving on to London, his men looted it. While this plundering was gentle when compared to the ravages of the 30 Years' War on the continent, inhabitants of nearby towns began forming into a citizens' army, prepared to resist further attacks.
Damn. I mean, yeah, if you look over at the continent, it's on fire at the moment. It's going through the 30 Years' War, one of the most brutal wars in European history up until that point. Germany's basically been burned to the ground by armies going back and forth, slaughtering civilians, famines. I mean, the 30 Years' War was incredibly brutal. I feel like it's kind of an underrated part of history. We don't talk about it that much, but very consequential and very brutal. Britain stayed out of it, partially due to the efforts of Charles. Much of the British populace wanted him to get involved, support the Protestant side, but him, with his perhaps sympathies to the Catholics, he didn't want to get involved, which, to be honest, was probably a good move. But England, or Britain, has avoided a lot of this brutality. Now they've got a war of their own, and they're getting a little piece of that.
When the Royalists approached the village of Turnham Green, only a few miles from London, they were opposed by a ragtag army of 24,000 parliamentarians, composed of men from the capital's trained bands, Essex's beaten army, and hastily armed civilians. Against this defensive bulwark, there was nothing Charles's army could do. The Royalist host was already short of supplies, and still depleted in numbers after Edgehill, and moreover, if the apparently imminent Battle of Turnham Green became a true battle, the killing of London's ordinary people, however armed they were, would likely turn the country against its king even more.
I mean, you can also see how this ended up inspiring a lot of political radicalism, and how the legacy of the English Civil War, was a legacy of sort of English liberty and English radicalism in politics. Because, this whole thing started out of political issues with the king. A lot of people were displeased with his abuses of power. And as you see here, you have regular people taking up arms to fight against the Royalist forces. That's definitely going to radicalize people, and some people became very radicalized. There was a spectrum. You have, of course, the leaders of the parliamentarians who are, they're nobles. So they may be radicals in favor of parliamentary power, but in terms of, say, individual liberty or liberty for the general population, many of them are not super into that. But when now you have regular people arming themselves and getting involved, you have a sort of more broad sense of radicalism developing. I'm very interested in the legacy of the English Civil War because, my area of study is more the late 18th century, and I look at things like, say, the American Revolution, and a lot of the founding fathers of the United States were very much inspired by the radicals of the English Civil War and sort of the political history of England. It's a really influential and fascinating period, I think.
So, after an incredibly tense standoff lasting almost all day, the Royalist army turned and withdrew at dusk. This was a pivotal moment in the war, for the Royalists had failed to retake the city, and its massive wealth, industry, ports, and strategic value would remain a keystone of parliamentarian power.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, power was not as centralized in London as it is today. I mean, if you look maybe the 1700s onward, 17, 18, 1900s to the present day, British power, wealth, people have been super concentrated in London. I mean, it became super important. At this point, it's not at that level of importance, but even so, capturing London would have been a massive victory for the Royalists. It's really something they wanted to do at this point, particularly so early in the war. This is, not going to be good for them down the line.
After this anticlimax, Charles dispersed his army to winter quarters in Oxford and the surrounding towns, where support for the king was most pronounced. Over that winter, the famous university city was transformed into an alternative military capital for the Royalist cause.
Whoa.
While the king's army put down roots for the cold season, Essex's still numerically superior force concluded the year by besieging and capturing Reading. After this, with disease and many other issues plaguing both armies, a stalemate set in. Essex wintered in the Thames Valley, where his army was dormant until the campaigning season of the next year. To further protect the capital, civilians began digging earthworks and other defences. By the turn of 1643, it was clear that any chance of a quick Cavalier victory had been snuffed out.
And, that's what I was saying at the beginning of this one. As we saw in the last episode, in the beginning of this episode, that was sort of the best chance Charles had to bring this war to a quick end. And in retrospect, his best chance for a victory at all. Now we've sort of passed that by. Now all of us, we know that we're going into years of warfare. And that's what, the participants of this war are going to soon start to experience. That endless slog, those countless battles between the two sides.
The immediate concern for Charles was a lack of military resources, particularly gunpowder and match. His wife, Henrietta Maria, was in the process of ferrying hundreds of barrels of these, other supplies and money to Oxford from the Low Countries. However, until he received these critical munitions, the main Royalist army was unable to undertake any proper offensives. Failure to capture any of the major port towns of the south meant that the Queen's convoy had to dock at the northern coastal town of Bridlington, which was under Newcastle's control at the time. For the time being, a wedge of parliamentarian-held territory sat between the king and his much-needed supplies.
Yeah, it's going to be sort of risky to set up those supply lines if you have to send them up to the north of England and then transport them all the way back down to Oxford. There's a lot of chances that you could be intercepted by the parliamentarian forces. So Charles is going to have to be careful in that. But obviously he needs to maintain those supplies. He needs gunpowder. He needs to keep the fight going.
Fact which made the Yorkshire campaign of 1643 even more vital. While the Queen took residence in York, Newcastle fought the two Fairfaxes for supremacy over Yorkshire's valuable clothing towns. In an early spring campaign, it seemed as though the Royalists were going to maintain their hegemony in the north. On March 30th, one of Newcastle's subordinates, George Goring, soundly defeated the northern parliamentarians at Seacroft Moor near Leeds. Unwilling to be defeated so easily, the Fairfaxes got back at him in May. On the night of the 21st, Sir Thomas Fairfax stormed Wakefield in an excellently executed night assault and captured Goring in the process. The setback was a shock to Newcastle and meant that the Yorkshire Royalists...
Fairfax will grow to be an important leader amongst the parliamentarians, and you're sort of starting to see why here.
Royalists were unable to spare any troops to assist their queen's progress back to Oxford. A few weeks earlier, Essex had roused Parliament's main army in the Thames Valley and used it to besiege Reading, a vital link in the defensive line shielding Charles's makeshift capital at Oxford. Essex took the city on April 25th after a blockade lasting almost 2 weeks. Unfortunately for the Lord General, his overly cautious nature and a massive outbreak of typhus among his soldiers crippled the Roundhead army, threw away its strategic initiative, and gave Royalist forces in the area much needed breathing room.
So we're seeing, basically a stalemate develop. The Royalists are making moves in the north, only to be countered by some daring action from Fairfax. The parliamentarians are making some moves in the south, but their action is blunted by disease. So still active on both sides, but we have sort of settled into a stalemate. No one has necessarily a super impressive advantage at the moment.
On June 1st, Henrietta Maria left York, accompanied by 5,000 men, and despite being clearly sighted by Essex's scouts, was not intercepted. As the supply convoy slowly moved south, the northern campaign reached a climax when Newcastle's 10,000 men cornered and crushed Thomas Fairfax's 3,500 at Old Walton Moor, securing Royalist control over Yorkshire and besieging the parliamentarians at Hull. Now free of pressure from the Thames Valley, Prince Rupert, victorious in many small raids and cavalry skirmishes, rode north to escort his queen the rest of the way.
It's starting to look up a little bit for the Royalists.
She finally entered Oxford on July 14th to rapturous applause and the ringing of bells. Everything was going the king's way, but the
I feel like that was probably a pretty big moment if you were there. And obviously you'd be a Royalist. You've had a couple of victories recently, and your supplies arrive, and not only do your supplies arrive, which are necessary to win the war, they arrive with the Queen. And if you're a devoted Royalist, you see the King and Queen as chosen by God. So this has got to be a pretty big moment for you. As I said, a rapturous response. I'm sure everybody there was feeling pretty great about their chances in that moment.
Royalist summer hadn't peaked just yet. The main threat to Oxford in 1643 was Sir William Waller's newly formed Western Association Army, operating in and around the area of modern Wiltshire and the southwest, threatening to cut off Royalist communication with Wales, a key recruiting ground. He was opposed in the west by the brilliant Royalist commander Sir Ralph Hopton, an old friend and comrade of Waller's with whom he had fought in the 30 Years' War decades earlier. He was also a notorious disciplinarian, touting the firm but fair motto, "Pay well, command well, hang well." After initial setbacks
fair enough, I guess.
in the west against Waller's forces, Hopton rallied his men and defeated his rival in a near-run battle at Lansdowne Hill in early July. However, the wheel of fortune turned quickly. When the Cavalier commander inspected prisoners from the battle, he was injured by an exploding powder magazine and temporarily put out of action. Waller took advantage of the chaos and almost trapped Hopton in the countryside, but his men just managed to retreat to Devizes, where they were besieged. After then, receiving reinforcements from Oxford,
That's some good luck for Waller. He took an L there, but still managed to advance forward. Due to a little bit of luck.
Charles's armies concluded affairs in the west at the conclusive Battle of Roundway Down. Once again, the Royalist advantage in horsemen paid off, and their mounted charge shattered the parliamentary line. Many terrified and fleeing Roundhead cavalry charged by accident down a hidden 300-foot drop, known since as the Bloody Ditch.
Jesus.
With that, the Western Association Army was utterly crushed.
Yeah, the Parliament of the Royalists is really giving them a massive advantage here. It makes sense they would have a better trained cavalry corps, given the composition of their forces and some of their experience, right? But yeah, it really seems to be getting them a lot of W's in many of these battles.
When news subsequently arrived in Oxford that their enemy's Western army had been totally annihilated, Charles dispatched Prince Rupert with 5,500 troops to reinforce Hopton's army. This opportunistic campaign, probably intended to take Gloucester, but Waller's retreat to the city bolstered its defences, making that objective unrealistic. So instead, the Royalist field army headed for Bristol, England's second most populated city. It also possessed key metalworking industries, which could be turned to the creation of weaponry, and a small fleet which had...
I didn't know Bristol was so important at the time. Second most populous, very interesting. And metalworking industries. Very fascinating. I mean, Britain was, the first country to majorly industrialize. We're mid-1600s, we're a bit early. But even, mid to late 1600s, we start to see the development of some small-scale industry in Britain, particularly, around textiles. And then throughout the 1700s, it will continue to develop. And Britain will become a truly industrial power in the 1800s, but, far ahead of anybody else. So even now, you do see some pretty impressive manufacturing in Britain in this era.
Had potential as the beginnings of a reborn navy. Rupert, whose very name was half a conquest, reached Bristol unopposed on July 23rd. 3 days later, his forces stormed the city's outer defences and managed to capture one of its gates. Realising his cause was hopeless, Parliamentary Governor Nathaniel Fiennes surrendered soon after. The capitulation was a coup for the Royalist forces in both morale and material. Around 80 guns were seized, along with 1,700 barrels of gunpowder and 6,000 muskets.
Whoa.
But
yeah, that's a pretty major haul from one battle. It's really looking up for the Royalists at this point. They've continued to see successes with some bumps along the way, but, this is a major win in their favor. This is definitely, very disadvantageous for the parliamentarians.
But the manpower cost had been a high one. As many as 500 Royalists were killed in the attack. With the gathered momentum, a Royalist War Council convened on August 4th and agreed that the next target would be Gloucester itself. With a population of 5,000, it controlled the Severn River and communications from Oxford to South Wales. By the 10th, Royalist armies completely surrounded the city, but instead of the surrender of its governor, Edward Massey, they were met with fierce resistance. Now facing an extensive siege, Charles's siege commander, the Earl of Forth, began a bombardment on the 13th. When news arrived of Gloucester's situation, total alarm struck Parliament due to fear that its loss might mean total collapse.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty important city to them, and at this point, as you can see from this map, it is incredibly isolated, so they're going to have to make some major efforts if they want to successfully defend it.
To remedy the situation, Essex's main army near London was swiftly reinforced with an influx of fresh troops and the trained bands of the city proper. At about this time, Edward Montague, Earl of Manchester, was given command of the newly formed Eastern Association Parliamentarian Army. He appointed an almost unknown cavalry commander, a certain Oliver Cromwell, as his second in command.
You knew he was going to pop up at some point. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Cromwell, but if you're not, once again, I'll just say keep an eye on Cromwell. He will be, perhaps the most important figure throughout this entire conflict eventually.
On August 25th, Essex's enlarged main army managed to save the beleaguered parliamentarian bastion in the west. Despite suffering multiple royalist attempts to hinder his army's progress, Essex reached Prestbury Hill, from which he could see the spires of Gloucester's great cathedral on September 5th. From there, the Thames army fired off a number of cannons to alert the city garrison that relief was close at hand. On the same day, Charles's almost months-long investment of Gloucester came to an end with total failure, his army withdrawing to Bristol.
Damn, and after, a couple of victories in quick succession, they could not manage to to win over this one.
Nevertheless, Essex's now vulnerable position provided the Royalists with a great opportunity to win the war anyway. The presence of London's trained...
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely an L for the Royalists, but it's not like this is catastrophic, a failed siege. You know, they still have many opportunities to take down the Parliamentarians. They're still in a pretty good position, so they can definitely pull a victory out of this situation, I think, you know, if they skillfully maneuver.
Bands in the field army meant that if the Cavaliers could bring Essex to battle and defeat him, a significant part of the capital's defenders would be lost with the army's destruction. Realizing the danger, the Lord General tried to trick his Cavalier opponents by moving up to Tewkesbury, feinting as if he was either going to march in a wide arc back to London using the northern route, or intended to invade Wales.
I do wonder what's going on in Wales at this point. You've heard it's a recruiting ground for the Royalists. It hasn't really been the center of combat. I do always sort of wonder about Welsh history. I'm not that familiar with British history in general. I'm somewhat familiar with modern British history, but, you know, prior to this, I don't know much. But it does seem to me that Wales is sort of attached to England at the hip and has been for a while. So, I'm always curious about why that happened. What has Wales' unique history been? Maybe they'll get involved at some point. We also, of course, have Scotland up north. I know a bit more about my home country, of course. We haven't heard of many goings-on up there so far. We've mainly been centered in England, but yeah.
When his ruse failed, Essex boldly made a run for safety via the southern route on September 15th. He almost succeeded,
for it.
But Prince Rupert's scouts detected the movement, caught up with the Parliamentarians via a more direct route, and savaged their dangerously overextended army at Oldbourne Chase. This forced Essex to delay his march, and allowed Charles's army to overtake his own. The Royalists occupied the town of Newbury on the gloomy afternoon of September 19th,
Here we go.
thereby putting themselves in a superior position between London and Essex, forcing the latter to rest on high ground south of Enbourne village. Defying his usually cautious nature and unwilling to stay on the back foot, the Earl of Essex roused his army, composed of 8,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, just before dawn.
It's a pretty impressive force. Also, there are more infantry, but it's almost split half and half between cavalry and infantry. Shows you the importance of cavalry in this conflict.
The general rallied his vanguard, asked whether they were willing to fight, and was met with the reply, "Let us fall upon them. We will, by God's assistance, beat it from them all." With that, Essex led his vanguard of 4,000 infantry and a small number of mounted men out at 6 a.m.
All right, Essex he's dropping the caution and he's going for it. And to be fair, I think he has to go for it. He's in a dangerous position. Something has to change, or the Parliamentarians are in big trouble.
Towards the strategic height of Round Hill, the Royalist forces hadn't properly reconnoitred the battlefield, and thus hadn't realized the escarpment's importance. So with relative ease, the Parliamentarians took the defensible position.
Okay, nice, good positioning. That's a good start.
The Cavalier army, made up of 7,000 infantry and a formidable 7,500 cavalry, began filing out of Newbury a few hours.
So they have, in fact, more cavalry than infantry, but once again, about split half and half. These two forces are around similar sizes. They're sort of numerically similar to each other.
Hours after the Parliamentarians assembled. While the main force organized itself, the energetic Prince Rupert rode out with 900 musketeers and some cavalry to take Round Hill himself. However, he was shocked to discover that the strategic high point was strongly defended by around 2,500 Parliamentarian soldiers.
Not this time, Rupert.
Whose presence blocked the Royalists. Realizing he couldn't make progress with his current strength, Rupert left the infantry under Colonel George Lissell and rode back to Newbury. News of Round Hill's capture by the Roundheads alarmed the Cavalier leadership, but a swiftly organized war council quickly decided what the objectives and deployment for the day would be.
God, the Royalists are pretty good at organizing, and Rupert is a very skilled commander. So, they do have a lot going for them.
With their plans finalized, Charles I's Royalist army began deploying on a north-south axis in 3 main sections. A relatively small number of troops, under William Vavasour's overall command, were stationed on the right wing, in the enclosed Kennet River Valley. In the centre, attacking Round Hill, were placed Sir Nicholas and John Byron. Prince Rupert and the majority of Royalist cavalry arrayed on an open area called Wash Common on the left, closer to the Enbourne River. England's second Stuart king raised his royal banner on a hill in the northern Kennet Valley area of the battlefield.
There he is.
It was on this front that the day's first action took place.
I'm very curious to see how this goes. I am not familiar with the specifics of the English Civil War, definitely not the individual battles, so I'm excited to see, how this battle goes and, what it's going to change.
Provoked by parliamentarian artillery fire raining down from Round Hill, Vavasour's royal regiments advanced in the
Vavasour, an interesting name. Doesn't necessarily sound English to me. I could be wrong. I'd be interested to know if anybody can tell me where that name comes from.
Valley's enclosed terrain and amidst dense hedgerows, moving forward on land which was far better suited for defense rather than attack.
Yeah, the parliamentarians seized a pretty impressive position. The Royalists didn't adequately survey the area, so that's a big advantage. That's a big advantage, particularly for defensive maneuvers.
After a brief, terse clash on this northern flank, the Royalist foot was easily blunted, with heavy losses.
Nice.
However, sensing an opportunity, the triumphant parliamentarian foot launched an attack of their own.
Okay, could be dangerous.
This thrust gained some ground, and managed to unbalance Vavasour's ranks, but the intervention of Charles's Lifeguard cavalry blocked it.
Okay.
For the
It went fine then. Look, an advance like that, it could be an incredibly good thing. You want to chase your opponent down. If you see they're beaten, if you think they're going to break, you want to keep going. But at the same time, we just talked about how the parliamentarians have a pretty impressive defensive position, and you don't want to leave your position unless you have to. That charge seemed relatively inconsequential. They went for it. They got pushed back. It could have gone a lot better or a lot worse.
Remainder of September 20th, both sides avoided closing with one another on the northern front. On the approaches to Round Hill, the two Byrons and their respective infantry and cavalry units.
Any relationship to the famous Lord Byron, the poet and writer, about almost 200 years down the line? I wonder.
Advanced up the slope in an attempt to dislodge the parliamentarians on top. However, their march was spotted, and they were met with fierce resistance from ranks of musketeers and emplaced culverins. During the vicious fighting which broke out on the hill, an intellectual and anti-war aristocrat known as Lord Falkland, who fought for the Royalists, was killed by a musket ball. Soon after...
well, that's a shame. Anti-war fella, he's at the battle, gets murdered. I'm sure his experience during this whole conflict was a rather interesting one.
Cavalier horsemen managed to rout a section of the parliamentarian centre and were close to securing Round Hill. However, professional officers in Essex's reserve saw the danger, plugged the gap, and used disciplined volley fire from muskets to repel the horsemen.
Hey, we've got some pretty competent leadership and soldiers on both sides of this battle. Throughout this whole conflict, I've been pretty impressed with how competent, this leadership and these soldiers have been. I guess that speaks to the impressive nature of the English army, though. A lot of the I don't know if a lot of, but at least some of the parliamentarian forces are just sort of random civilians that have recently been armed. I reckon they're probably, in general, not as well trained as the forces of the Royalists, though I could be wrong. It's interesting the difference in composition between the two armies, but they do both seem relatively competent.
The king's forces were stuck in a stalemate here as well. As brutal close-quarters fighting was taking place on Round Hill, Prince Rupert was busy organising 6,000 royalist horses on Wash Common. When the first line of cavalry was ready, it charged into Sir Philip Stapleton's parliamentarian horse, who hadn't fully formed up on the opposite side of the common. Stapleton managed to put together a defence in time, using new delayed close-range volley tactics to drive the royalist cavalry back twice.
Impressive.
However, amidst the crack of carbines and clang of poleaxes on plate, Prince...
Great description, by the way. I mean, I love some of the literary flourishes that are included.
Rupert managed to turn the parliamentarian cavalry's flank on the third charge, driving them back to Skinner's Green Lane. In the afternoon, reserve units of the London trained bands strode into the breach on Wash Common left by the cavalry, repulsing a probing charge by Rupert's horse. Instead, the Royalists resorted to a massive artillery barrage aimed at breaking the final parliamentarian ranks. However, the supposedly inferior trained bands, who had no cover on the open plain...
There you go, supposedly inferior trained bands. That's what I was getting at earlier. You know, they may not have the same level of training as the Royalists, but they have been performing admirably, and it seems like we're about to see an impressive performance from them.
Defied all expectations and stood stalwartly, maintaining their formation for many hours, even in the face of massed but inaccurate culverin fire.
Yeah, that's incredibly impressive. If you look at this era of warfare, and by this era I honestly mean, you know, here up until like the 1800s, you know, one of the main things you want to train your soldiers to do is to stand steady in the face of firepower, enemy firepower. Because, I mean, imagine if you're a soldier in that situation. It is incredibly easy if you're being bombarded by artillery or being shot at or charged at. You know, it's incredibly easy to let yourself be taken by fear and to run away. In fact, it's the natural human response. You're being attacked, you should run. So, you know, one of the most important things to train your men is the ability to stand strong. And that's a really tricky thing to do. I mean, you need men who are well-trained, who are motivated, with good leadership, and there's many factors. And so these sort of, you know, bands of men who've been rounded up, probably not much training, you know, it's a really impressive feat to stand steady in the face of so much enemy firepower.
Nevertheless, this constant shelling eventually weakened the gallant parliamentarian reserves. When
it shows, I think, a real belief in the cause, clearly. If they're willing to do that, they must have a real belief in what they're doing.
Prince Rupert then led a thunderous mounted charge across the Common's northern sector at around 4 p.m. Essex's trained bands began to break, tearing open his line and threatening...
No one can last forever, you know, hours of being shot at, charged, you know, but very impressive stand nonetheless. Of course, now Rupert's charging at him, and we've seen him before.
To scythe the entire army in two. At precisely that moment, the Earl of Essex bravely galloped onto the scene, riding among his retreating troops and inspiring them to turn around and fight.
And there's the other element I was talking about, good leadership. You know, these men... they have a belief in the cause. Maybe they don't have the training that they should have, but they have a leader who's willing to get on their Essex and go down and inspire them. You know, force them to turn back around and fight. A very important element.
In one account, a cannonball is said to have landed only a yard from the Lord General, but his personal intervention was necessary. The trained bands, particularly their red and blue units, turned around and charged at the Royalists, reforming their formation and stabilizing the front. After some subsequent lighter combat, both armies began disengaging at 7 p.m. after a ruthless 14-hour...
long day of work. Let's head home for the night, boys. But, I mean, for real, you know, if you have two of these armies fighting each other for hours and hours on end, there's only so long they can go before they start collapsing. So it's in everybody's best interest to, you know, go and get a night's rest. You know, it may seem a little odd to some of you, like they're in the middle of a battle, they just break it off. Well, I mean, yeah, everybody has to sleep.
Our stalemate. Charles's forces retreated all the way to Newbury, where they stayed the night and conferred about what to do. The next morning, the Royalists chose to not re-engage, either because of depleted gunpowder supplies or because the High Command simply lost its nerve. Both armies lost about the same number of troops at 1,300 each.
Yeah, I mean, considering the size, the number of men they had, that's a pretty large number of casualties.
And even though Rupert had come close to victory, Essex escaped back to London in the aftermath. Newbury was...
Once again, the parliamentarians have managed to sort of scamper away. Throughout this whole conflict, I'd say the Royalists have sort of held the advantage. We haven't seen a lot of massive victories on behalf of the parliamentarians. We've seen some victories, but not at the same scale. But the parliamentarians have managed to survive so far. They've managed to escape total destruction, and they've done it once again.
Was just as tactically inconclusive as Edge Hill had been the year before. Nevertheless, the battle would have far-reaching consequences.
Really?
Although the king's armies were dominant in every theatre as 1643 came to an end, parliamentarian allies in the far...
Okay, I can't help but say that those red troops kind of look like they're dressed like Santa Claus. It's not a very academic thing of me to say, I apologize, but I couldn't help but say it.
North were about to change the nature of the entire war. The Royalist summer had ended. Our series on the English Civil War will continue, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely.
Yes, and please do the same for this video. And check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. So apparently Royalist summer is over. Obviously, that means that they're not going to find so much success as they have been seeing so far. I'm very curious to see where this series goes. I've been enjoying it a lot so far. Like I said, I'm really interested in the ideological aspects of this conflict, and I hope they cover that a little bit down the line. I know that some of that stuff comes in, further along than what we're looking at right now. But I really hope they do cover some of that stuff, the politics and the ideology, when we get to it. Of course, if they cover the whole conflict, this will be a very long series, but I don't know what they intend to do. Anyway, I've enjoyed it so far. If you guys enjoyed this one, like I said, and like they said, do all the usual stuff like comment, subscribe, check out the Patreon, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.